Hello students and welcome to the next lesson in our AS level psychology course. Today we're going to be looking at stress inoculation training. What is stress inoculation training? Stress inoculation training, otherwise known as SIT, is a psychological method of coping with stress and its effects on the body. It's a cognitive behavioral therapy where one's behavior becomes resistant to the effects of a stressor. So as a result, the stress isn't going to have that big of an impact on them. So it can also be referred to as a type of therapy. It consists of three phases. So the first of which is conceptualization. This is the first phase of the therapy where the client is urged to think differently about the stress. The therapist then explores the past stressful events and evaluates which coping strategies have worked in the past. So firstly, of course, the client is going to start to think of the stress in a different way, as opposed to firstly thinking about the stress negatively because it really freaks them out. They can think of the stress as a way to motivate them in their work. Now, once the therapist now knows that the client has changed their kind of thinking and way of thought about the stress, they're then going to implement some coping strategies which they know that the client has told them have worked in the past. Then, with these techniques and coping strategies, the client is then going to have to deal with the stress to suppress its symptoms. So all of these techniques are then going to be used in kind of training processes, and they're going to be rehearsed over time. Then the client is encouraged to apply all of the training that they've been doing to deal with the stress into the real world. They're given simulations to see if it's going to work in the form of a stimulation. This way they follow through all of their training and see if it has worked and their stress levels have been suppressed. Now we're going to evaluate SIT. The first point of evaluation is that it's advantageous because it treats the source of the stress, not just the symptoms. If we were to compare this to a physiological method of coping with stress, for example the taking of drugs such as benzodiazepines and beta blockers, they're going to actually treat the source of the stress and not only suppress all of its symptoms, so as a result it's going to work in the long term and you're not going to have the stress again. Also, unlike with drug use, there's no risk of addiction, which can be harmful on the human body. There are no substantial health risks to it and no kind of secondary effects or side effects which you can have from using this method of therapy. However, you would so if you use drugs. Also, it won't work in the short term. It's a long-term process that takes a long time. Now, this is a negative point of evaluation because if you are going to do SIT, it's going to take quite a while to actually do all of the training and then actually follow through with it in the application part at the end in step 3. So as a result, it's not going to work in the short term. However, the use of drugs may do so like that, such as beta blockers or benzodiazepines. Also, it's more expensive than using drugs to deal with the stress. As a result, it may not be able to be applicable for everyone in the general population, even those who may not have the money in order to pay for it. Also, the outcomes of the SIT therapy is going to depend on the skills of the therapist. If the therapist isn't very good at identifying which methods of stress have worked in the past in step 1 and giving the techniques for the stress levels to decrease in step 2, then the levels of stress aren't going to decrease at all. So it always will depend on the skills of the therapist. Now we're going to look at an SIT experiment. Meichenbaum conducted an experiment to see if stress inoculation training would work to reduce the levels of stress in a population and how effective it was. So he tested SIT on a group of students. What he did is that he got a sample of students at a college that were going to take an exam and divided them into 3 different groups. The first group got 8 weeks of stress inoculation training. The second group got 8 weeks of systematic desensitization. And the third group had no therapy whatsoever. They were told that they were on the waiting list to get into one of these 2 groups. The students were then given a self-evaluation questionnaire to assess their stress levels after the exam period. So what do they find? Well, the group that had stress inoculation training got higher grades than the other 2 groups. The group that did get stress inoculation training also had more positive evaluation forms, stating that they had lower levels of stress throughout the period. So it can be concluded that SIT is successful at reducing stress and anxiety in stressful situations. Now we're going to evaluate this experiment. Firstly, the students were not tested to see if they were using another stress management technique, for example the use of drugs as benzodiazepines and also as beta blockers, not really the illegal drugs which you may use for other objectives. These are just ones to limit stress. Now what this means is that since they didn't test for it, a lot of the students could have actually used it and this would have affected the results. Also, students could have been subject to evaluation apprehension on their questionnaires and lied, saying that the stress inoculation training did actually help them lower levels of stress simply because they wanted to look good and look as if it worked on them. Also, the sample size wasn't very valid at all if you want to get a general application to the population. They only tested students who of course are going to be a lot different with the use of coping with a form of therapy than the rest of the population. Also, it shows that SIT works for facing exams, but not other activities. It may lower levels of stress and help with your exams, but that doesn't mean it's going to help you at work, for example. Here are some questions on stress inoculation training, the 3 steps to it, and Meichenbaum's study. Have a go at answering these on another sheet of paper by pausing the video and hit play for whenever you're ready to see the answers. Here are the answers. If you got all of these right, congratulations. I'd advise you to move on to the next video, which will be on emotional focused methods of coping with stress. As always, thanks for watching and I'll see you then.